Are we in a fighting game bubble, or is this the new norm? Have you noticed that every fighting game that comes out seems to be bigger than the last? The fighting game genre seems to have made a big comeback ever since Street Fighter 4 came out. And it hasn't shown any signs of slowing down. At least not so far. Street Fighter 4 is the best-selling Street Fighter of all time. Tekken 7 is the second best-selling Tekken game ever, only after the legendary Tekken 3. Mortal Kombat X and 11 are the two biggest-selling Mortal Kombats of all time. Every single fighting game that comes out seems to be selling records. Better than ever. Now, of course, we have to acknowledge that gaming itself has gotten a lot bigger through the years. But you have to remember the huge drop in fighting games through the early 2000s. Gaming was still growing then, but all fighting games we got sold mediocrely at best, even if we got any fighting games. It feels like after the year 2000 to about 2008, we only got a handful of games. Don't get me wrong, we got some gems during this time, like Tekken 5, Dead or Alive 4, or even Guilty Gear XX, but none of them sold particularly well. With the exception of Tekken 5, that sold actually pretty decently. It is actually the best-selling game during those times. I believe it sold in 6 million copies, or something like that. But compared to even Tekken 3, which came out much earlier, which sold over 10 million copies. So it's obviously a downgrade. But maybe that's unfair. Tekken 3 is after all one of the best fighting games ever made. But it is not a unique story with Tekken. It seems to be with all fighting games. Virtua Fighter sales were dropping, Guilty Gear sales were dropping, Mortal Kombat sales were dropping. It seems every single fighting game, if they even came out with new ones, the sales were mediocre. But then, 2007, we finally got it. Capcom announced a sequel to probably the most popular fighting game ever, and people went nuts.
Oh my fucking god! It's happening!
If you can't remember it, it was crazy. People who had never played a fighting game in their life were excited. Because the name carried so much weight. You have to remember, Street Fighter is one of the few gaming series which is known even in the mainstream media.
Of course!
The announcement immediately had a ripple effect all around the industry. It brought tons of new players, revived many older series. After Street Fighter 4 released, every big fighting game seems to only get bigger. The effect wasn't maybe immediate, but when it hit hard. Suddenly, Soul Calibur 4 sold twice as much as 3 did. Mortal Kombat went from selling around 1 million copies with Mortal Kombat Armageddon to about 2 million with Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. Yeah, and then suddenly, in 2011, Mortal Kombat 9 comes out and sells 5 million copies, immediately. And that is only the beginning. Suddenly all fighting games break records. Guilty Gear comes back, Tekken 7 explodes on the scene, MKX casually sells 11 million units, Killer Instinct makes a comeback. Plus we get a ton of new fighting games like Injustice, Skullgirls, even Persona 4 Arena. Slightly ironically, the only not instant success around this period is Street Fighter 5, which had a very rocky launch and took years to correct itself. But at this point I would say it is considered a success. Man, they really failed that launch, did they? And then if we look only at modern titles, Tekken 7 has sold badonkers, Mortal Kombat 11, crazy. Soul Calibur 6 even is the best selling in that franchise. fighterz was the fastest selling Dragon Ball game ever. Even things like Samurai Showdown became the best selling SNK game ever made. I think also the death of the arcade played a huge role in the decline of the fighting game. You see, in Japan, where they didn't die out, FGCs survived and they played a lot of fighting games. But over here in the West, with the death of the arcade, it seems a lot of our community got splintered. And it's not until, the internet really took off that the FGC came back together, and that's probably one of the reasons also in 2008 we got this resurgence. But is this the new norm? Is every fighting game here on out just gonna get bigger? Or are we in a sort of bubble which is gonna burst at some point? Frankly, we don't know. But I for one do think all genres ebb and flow during years. And we just have happened to be in a big spike now, and it's very possible we are at the tail end of this spike. Currently, there are only 2 big fighting games coming out, Guilty Gear Strive and King of Fighters 15. We know they are making Street Fighter 6, thanks to the big leaks at Capcom, but that seems to be multiple years away now, and we have no new word of Riot's fighting game. We would assume they're making a new fighterz, but still no word from it, so maybe it's a bit worrying we only have 2 big fighting games coming out in probably the next 2 years. But I don't think it's time to panic just yet. We have to remember, nowadays game development is harder, more expensive and time consuming. So I don't think this small lack is anything to fret. Now, if we reach 2022 without any announcements of any kind, then we can start to really worry about this. But considering fighterz, Tekken and Street Fighter are almost guaranteed making sequels as we speak, I wouldn't be surprised by a new Injustice either, or maybe even a Soul Calibur. So, I think we're gonna have plenty of announcements by 2022. That is not to say I don't think fighting games can burst the bubble and stop making new ones. Gaming itself is a relatively new phenomenon. It is hard to say if any genre dies out or just hibernates. RTSs went from the biggest thing in the world to a small niche. But the book is still out if it remains like that, or it's gonna rise again. MMOs are kind of doing the same thing right now. Back in the mid-2000s, MMOs were the biggest thing on the planet, and now they are a bit niche. And it's very possible that they just need one big game to come out to revive the whole genre. So, at the moment, if you're a fan of fighting games, it is a good time to be alive. Unless you're a giant pessimist and worry too many good fighting games means they split the population so much that none of them good enough matchmaking. There's not enough population to make decent matches. At least I can say I have a hard time believing we will ever be going back to the drought of the early 2000s. So enjoy your fighting games. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Join in on the conversation. Tell me what you think. Tell me what I got wrong. Tell me what you disagree with. I threw a lot of numbers around in this video. Hopefully they are about correct, as most of them are just based on speculation, some articles talking about what they hope, what they achieved, so on and so on. But guys, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. Bye bye.